right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Narisha Morale, one of the co-directors of Outreach and Recruitment, and I will be your host slash moderator today. Right, so as everyone's supposed to know that today we're celebrating World Population Day, and our theme for this session is COVID, lockdown, and climate change: impact on women's reproductive rights. In recent years, the topic of climate change and women's rights have become staple conversations. People are becoming more aware of how these issues affect women and girls. However, despite increasing recognition of the linkages between climate change, women's rights, and women's health, there has not been targeted conversations of how these environmental issues impact women's sexual and reproductive health rights. So today on World Population Day, we want to highlight these linkages, and we have a great panel of women who are making strides within their respective fields, and we're going to have a very enlightening conversation. The Jamaica Climate Change Youth Council has always maintained that COVID-19 isn't just a public health issue, it is also a social and environmental issue. Across the globe, the climate crisis has affected and it continues to affect many persons, primarily poor and marginalized populations, resulting in loss of homes, livelihood, and even lives. According to the Climate Change Report 2021 by Women Deliver, women and men experience extreme events such as floods, windstorms, droughts, and even heat waves differently. In fact, they say that women and children are said to be more than 14 times more likely than men to die in the aftermath of natural disasters. Furthermore, there is strong evidence linking climate change to negative maternal health outcomes, an increased prevalence of gender-based violence, and a lack of sexual health and reproductive services, which in turn negatively impact family planning, abortion, and STI outcomes. Climate change is therefore a significant risk factor of women's sexual and reproductive health outcomes. Again, today we are joined by a panel of incredible women who are working to advocate for women at the various intersectionalities within society. Our panelists are Miss Aisha Constable, who is the youth advocate of women's leadership and founder of Girls Care Jamaica and Young People for Action on Climate Change. Miss Nicolette Bryan, who is our executive director of We Change, and Miss Shellyan Weeks, executive director and founder of Her Flow. All right, thank you so much for joining us, ladies.
Yeah, lovely to be here.
All right. It says that if we do not adequately prepare for these climate change related disasters, we can start to see reduced access to sexual reproductive health services for women, as well as increased prevalence of infection and diseases, right?
Yes.
So, Miss Nicolette, I will start off with you because you said you will be leaving shortly. So,
yes, no problem. Thank you for that.
All right. So, knowing what we do about the relationship of women and girls with water, what would be a good starting point for a discourse such as this?
So there are many starting points. I really don't know if there would be a good one, but one of them would always have to be access and really just how much we are allowing little by little for us for the country limited access to potable water. Water is very intrinsic to what women's roles are tied to. As much as we're trying to change roles and gender roles that women have, we have to admit the roles that they do have and primarily have in society. And much of this is largely linked to water, sanitation, hygiene practices, getting your children ready, preparing your meals, the farm,
Yes.
everything. So that major for me is access. And when I say access, a typical example would be like the cockpit country, or the other. I really forgot the other one in Ocharias, where you're finding that these are watershed areas, and these are areas that where your water, your rivers would start, they would begin. This is where people would fetch water. And if it is that you're trying to sell off these properties or do things to them that would affect just how much water is produced or just affect the access in general. That has far reaching impact for livelihoods of people and or for what people would want water to do. So access is the first thing. And we can't have any sort of conversation if there's no access. And one of the first starting points and fighting points that we have as a country, as women, as marginalized people, really is to ensure and fight to ensure that access is maintained, as they continue to encroach more and more and more on the sources of these.
Yes, I agree. Access, equal rights, equity is important across the board for
Mm-hmm.
empowerment in order to further along our women and our girls.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I'm going to post this to both Nicolette and Aisha. In much
Mm-hmm.
of the world, women are often responsible for gathering and producing as well as collecting water. With
Mm-hmm.
climate change, these tasks are becoming more difficult. How
Mm-hmm.
do gender norms, roles, and relationships account for differences in impact between women and men related to climate disasters?
That's a long one, a very long one. But roles different. To be honest with you, like what I said before, so the roles that you have and the ones that you occupy, they dictate what you ought to do. They dictate what your responsibilities are. So as a result, women and their roles and their power and their whole situation, to use the words advocacy language, power and positioning. So it's going to affect you differently, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't affect men. It doesn't affect all genders because marginalized populations do exist,
Mhm.
outside of women. So you're talking about children, you're talking about LGBT people, you're talking about primarily marginalized people. And when you're talking within the context of climate change, it makes everything worse for people who are already worse affected. So just thinking about the third world countries, and I'm using quotations with these global south and third world countries and so on. We are the persons that don't contribute to much of what exacerbates climate change, but the effect is on us. The rising sea levels and the lowering river levels are, the things that are affecting us as a result of global north countries and larger industrialized countries and so on. So it really does affect us because we experience the very direct nature of it, the very direct nature of perhaps having to go further, of having for water, for having to say, well, your house can't clean and it smell away because this is your duty, and you perhaps can feel a feeling of failure too. So this can also have a psychological impact because I know for many of us, especially like some of us have aunties and mothers who they pride themselves on the cleanest homes, the best looking children who are the most tidy. So think of the fact that somebody might not be able to carry out their roles, which they feel they cling very tightly to, because they don't have the necessary means to practice sanitation and hygiene. That has a psychological impact on you as a person. Yeah, you don't, your kids are not as spiffy and your house is not as clean. You can't invite somebody in and think of what might happen. So it might affect us differently. Not might affect, it does affect us differently. But it's not to say it doesn't affect the other, because everybody has to live in this world. But the persons again who are the drivers of climate change, which are largely men, largely cis men, largely global north white men. As much as I'm pretty sure they might go outside and feel the heat, at the same time you can afford an AC. So that the effect and the impact on you would be a little bit different, and especially if you're in a space where it's not as hot like Jamaica can get. The global warming effect seems like quotation for you, is something that you might want to use quotations for. So that's just some simple examples of how it does affect us differently across genders.
Yeah, I honestly agree as well. Water is very essential, vital part of life, and without
Hmm.
it, women are not able to carry out certain important.
Hmm.
Is Yeah, it's a very, as Emmy is saying. I feel like we don't talk about this enough. Access to clean water
Hmm.
is literally a limiting factor to sustainable development. A lot of
Hmm.
women, especially young girls, need water for whether
Hmm.
they're on their menses, pregnant women. It's very, and without it, it becomes without water, dehydration, a lot of things that can happen without water is a
Mm-hmm.
very important vital thing. Aisha,
Yes.
I
Mm-hmm.
want to pose the same question. How do these gender norm and roles would you think account for differences in impact between women and men as related to climate disasters?
Yeah. So thanks again for the opportunity to participate in this very important conversation. Um, I think Nicolette started us off really well by highlighting some of the key issues and facts to consider as a part of this topic. There's a lot to unpack within it. We talk about climate change as a very static thing when it really isn't.
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which it is experienced in different spaces is largely determined by underlying factors, which is why, the question of how it affects different groups, different countries is so very important. But then it boils down to what are the other socioeconomic and sociopolitical and cultural realities in these spaces. So water as a thematic area within climate studies is just one very small part of that discussion. Going back to the very first question you posed, I think an important starting point to this narrative is what are the impacts of climate change? What are the risks being posed by climate change, and how will it affect the different resources? So when we talk about water, one of the big things that we talk about in terms of climate adaptation is the importance of, say, water harvesting. And I think sometimes people get lost in that discussion so much that they forget that one of the big risks of climate change and what we've already seen happening, and Nicolette alluded to this, is that we're having less and less precipitation. So we have even less access to this natural resource. So what are we harvesting? What are we even talking about, tapping into if we're not going to have enough of this resource? And again, Nicolette again alluded to this in terms of these intersectionalities. So when we talk about women, recognizing that women is not a homogeneous group, there are other experiences that women within the gender group is having, and that even boils down to the norms that we talk about across the group, and the expectations, the division of labor, and some very standard now, I believe, imperatives when we talk about women. So, the burden of care that women have, the large, the bulk of unpaid work that women carry out. If we talk about water, for example, we're talking about the ways in which men and women value this resource differently. Going back to the point of how women use water to clean their houses and bathe children, we're talking about the fact that men see this resource, especially if we're talking farming sector, talking, men wanting this resource to water their animals and water their plants, and women needing this to bathe their children and take care of domestic chores, and that being the basis of domestic violence and conflicts in the home. So there's so much to unpack, and sometimes we get lost in the discussion because there's just so many points that we can connect, and it's to someone outside of our spaces, maybe it seems like we're throwing everything in the bag, but the reality is that it is just that complicated, and that interconnected, and it's very important that we don't try and mask the complexity of the issue, because if we do that, then we do so at the risk of failing to create solutions to this climate crisis that make sense to the people who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis itself.
Very true, very true. Because even as you mentioned, with less precipitation, since there's less and there's more competition, women and girls who are a lot of times the persons who go out there to collect water, they have to travel further distances. Pregnant women who are they have to carry all that heavy load, and dehydration, which is going to lead to a higher rate of maternal mortality. Those are things that persons are not even taking into consideration when you talk about climate change and the less amounts of water that will be available to our women and our girls.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right, Narisha. And it goes even to livelihoods too, because when you think of perhaps outside of Jamaica, when I think of Southeast Asia fracture workers, I was amazed at how much water goes into creating one pair of jeans and a dye it. It was like I don't remember, and I don't want to misquote myself, but when you're thinking of even a space settings like those where all our H&Ms and our Gap clothes come from, and women are the people in these factories, women and children that, sometimes, we don't even know that child labor is going on. But when you think about their access to water and how it affects their livelihoods, because if there's no water, how do they even work for that underpay they're already getting, So that is also one of them. And we also have to think about stuff like when natural disasters happen, which are being exacerbated by climate change, and they're always going to shift budget from social programs to fixing infrastructure. So now that all of Marcus Garvey Drive has been dug up and everything, we can just imagine that the gender part of the governance budget or that line item, that would probably get the least. Our social programs will get the least because you must fix your roads, you must fix what is in
Yeah.
front of you, and that shifts something. So that is also an indirect and direct impact as well.
Yeah.
Just how resources get allocated
They,
across
they
our
were
government.
they were
Yeah.
already
Yeah.
getting the least. What it means now
Mhm.
is that they might not get none.
True,
You
it's
know,
true, Aisha. Yeah.
there's this now
Yeah.
being pertinent, immediate issue to address. And
Mhm.
one of the things that I failed to mention as I spoke earlier was the matter of the shadow pandemic, which has been worsened, over time. We've always had to deal with this, but that of gender-based violence. And again,
Mhm.
tying that back to the worsening conditions that we see with climate change and how that's going to expand. Because what we've seen, and we've seen it even as it relates to unpaid labor in these sweatshops in Southeast Asia, but we're seeing it closer to home in the informal economy and where women are being forced out of certain sectors and last streams of work now because there's this competition and increased competition because formal job opportunities are on the decrease. So
Mhm.
again, just all these interconnections and interlinkages between these things that we normally take for granted that we have to make.
Yeah,
Mhm.
as somebody saying, gifted island child, that people generally don't consider just how connected everything is. Less potable water, lack of access, natural disasters, all impact women's reproductive health. Everything is connected. Yes, very true, very true. I was even reading.
Hello. I'm not
Mhm.
sure if I'm supposed to wait for somebody to invite me on or if I can just jump in or I was kind of waiting my turn. I'm not sure what to do. So,
Oh, sorry about that, Miss Shelley. So thank you for joining us. I noticed you joined a bit late and everything. I hope you're doing well. Yeah, so I will pose my next question, and
no,
this.
but before you pose the question, I wanted to chime in because I hear a lot of conversation around the availability of water and just how it affects women in the climate change
Yes.
conversation. And while it is very important for us to highlight what's going on in Southeast Asia, right here in Jamaica, you have girls in schools who stop from schools because they do not have access to menstrual products. And it's not
Yes,
just the
that's very
menstrual
true.
products that count as access, but there most of the schools, especially in very rural areas, do not have access to running water. So when you think about menstrual hygiene and just being trying to maintain some sort of healthy lifestyle, the lack of access to water becomes problematic because now you're talking about not just the ramifications of lack of good hygiene, but even something as important as staying hydrated is definitely
Education.
affected. I see somebody in the comment mention how it affects reproductive health, and it absolutely does. If you see the numbers right now, you realize that reproductive health issues are skyrocketing. The last figures I look at is about 80% of women are affected by
Hmm.
some sort of reproductive health issue. And if you look at the numbers, women of color are the ones who are topping that list. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we do not have access to basic essentials in our life daily in order to accommodate us being able to live a healthier lifestyle. And when we talk about reproductive health, it's not just about periods and fibroids and endometriosis. Maternal mortality is a massive thing that is happening, especially now because there are a lot more women of color dying as a result of poor access to some of these essential items because they just simply can't get it when they need it. So climate change is not only affecting our life, we are dying faster. So I really wanted to include that part of in the conversation because yes, a lot of our decisions are being made by men, and maybe because of that, they don't consider how female reproductive health is affected by climate change. But it is really something that I think we must put some attention to, because women are literally dying.
Yes, it's so true. What even I was reading, they're saying how water affects pregnant women. Like if they don't get enough or they're dehydrated, it affects hormones. It
It
affects
does.
development of the fetus. It really does have a changing on the whole the woman develops during her pregnancy and the child. So it's very important.
Also, a lot of pain and discomfort that we feel with our periods, that we just blame on periods and say, oh, well, periods are painful, are related to dehydration. If you simply drink more water, you won't feel a lot of that pain.
And may I just add, within the context of the discussion around climate and climate impacts, one of the things that a lot of islands are already experiencing, and more so in the Eastern Caribbean, Barbados, for example, is one of them, where increased sea level rise is leading to salinization of their groundwater. And that
Mm.
in and of itself has serious implications for women generally, and the population generally, but more so pregnant women, where this high salt content in the water is leading to miscarriages in a lot of women. And because, again, women tend to be more prone to non communicable diseases such as hypertension, that is also on the increase. So, again, a very clear connection there between a very overt climate impact and the health implications for women.
That's very true.
Yeah, so true. All
Hmm.
right. So, one key population that is often ignored in these conversations is transgender men who may have similar reproductive health needs to cisgender women. How can
Hmm.
we expand the climate change conversation to include the needs of this population? And I'm asking this question to Miss Nicolette.
Yeah, to be honest, I think sometimes people take it for granted, and perhaps if everybody's guilty of this, using everybody loosely, because if they feel like if the issue is addressed among women, and are people who identify as women, then trans men should fall in line. But the thing about it is that you sort of have to identify people, or even
Yeah,
let them know that they're welcome to this conversation, because sometimes people don't think of themselves as being part of conversations or part of target groups unless you name them. So especially people who are marginalized, they just tend to feel that they're marginalized out of everything. So the first step would be, because I think the foundation is there in terms of what reproductive assistance would be needed. I think the language is what's important. So outside of making the services available, I think just language to say you are included, you're welcome, this is about you as well. And I really think that is really it. So the moment we get the language right, and to ensure that they're included in every piece of document. So when we say women in all their diversities and trans men or something, we make it very evident. Or even if when we speak of women or a certain population, we make it very clear that it's very inclusive and you are also welcome. Because sometimes people just see something and just say, oh, I didn't assume you meant me as well. And especially when you are always on the outside and excluded. And I can tell you that I know what it is like to live on the fringes. I feel like I'm excluded from everything. So for them, it's even worse. So I can tell you that much, that it makes sense to say you, meaning identifying you as a population, as a person in language, because I feel like the services themselves, because they'll be similar, the needs would be very similar in a lot of ways. Um, we can continue in the same vein of advocacy, but ensure that our language remains welcoming. And it's more than just language. It's more than just saying it on paper. It's really saying it. If it means enlisting the help of somebody from the community to to ensure that it seems that way, you have to do that and to gain the trust. So that is where I would start. And that is so once you have that, and then you have them in your space, they will tell you how it is they would feel better included. And I speak for communities very, not definitively, but from what I know and work, and I can speak of from what I'm certain about. So, but I also don't want to speak definitively for any community. But absolutely, start with the language. And once you have the language, they say, "Oh, I'm included," and then they themselves will reach out to you. You can say to them, "Come to us," and from there you can have anything.
Yeah, I agree. At every level of decision making, there needs to be some form of representation or inclusivity in order to make better decision making skills.
Mhm.
All right. So we're moving on as
Mhm. Oh, and just one thing. So if anybody has any questions for me, I have to leave in like the next 10 minutes. So just pop them in the chat, and I'll be happy to chat to talk to you. And I'm putting my email address here as well. So if anybody has anything that comes up in your mind that you might want to ask me, feel free to shoot my email, and I'll be sure to talk as well. So yeah. So sorry to cut you, Narisha.
no problem.
Hmm.
Okay, so I will pose this final question to you and as well as the other panelists. And if there are any other questions for Nicolette, you guys can ask them in the chat and I'll direct them to her as well. So,
Hmm.
due to the increase in climate disasters, there is a greater increase in environmental migration. Vulnerability of women and girls is exacerbated even more so for LGBTQ individuals and disabled women. Do you think our shelters are equipped to handle the special needs of these individuals? And I'm going to ask Nicolette to
Really?
answer first.
No, so none at all. It's absolutely a no. So even taking out of, so at the bare minimum, they're not ready, and the bare minimum would mean a person who is cis who would not have any angst around their sexuality and they're fine and they're accepted everywhere. For that person, it's not even there. One of the big problems that you'll find coming out, which is also Caribbean wide. So like Port Royal women will tell you that them not got no shelter because now I touch up my daughter. And I remember seeing a viral video the other day with the eruption in St. Vincent where a woman was saying, no, she not got no shelter because they're gonna do stuff to her daughter as well, and they were making fun of her. Um, so it's clearly it's a region wide, worldwide problem with that. So it's not equipped in the least for the persons who perhaps would be most accepted. So just imagine the people that they would have to make special provisions for to make them feel even more accepted and welcome. There's none. So we don't even have we don't have any sort of any coordinated disaster response mechanism, to be very honest with you, that speaks about how we deal with people who are differently abled, how we deal with people of different marginalized groups, and so on. It's just a matter of who can get assistance to reach the venue. But there are no assurances as to, these are the bottles of water that you need. How do we ensure that they have clean linen? How do we ensure that they have I can tell you that every time there's a natural disaster across the Caribbean, there's always a huge pad drive from UN agencies to agencies like Shelley's from her flow, to just natural do-gooders, because the first thing you want to do is offer a pad, because suddenly you're just out of whack. And just imagine yourself in a shelter trying to find yourself a shower twice a day, where you usually like doing in a time like this. So absolutely no on the shelters. Shelters are a touchy topic for me and for women's groups in Jamaica, because it's one of the things governments do successively to say is a shelter is coming and you never hear where the shelter is. And then you have a bag of people, your constituents, and people who reach out to you to say, how do I get out of this situation? And you end up not knowing even what to do. So on that front, absolutely, Narisha, it's a no. The government gets a failing grade, and it's really up to us to start to build mutual aid systems, which is what something that we're working on, that we change. So if somebody needs to escape a situation, we say, listen, we have a couch, come over. We have to find different ways of assisting our groups and people, but shelters are not it, and we have no faith in them at all. I hope that answers this completely.
Yeah.
I would like to address that as well.
Yeah.
Um, as a part of
Mm-hmm.
our outreach to Her Flow, we include shelters, homes, government facilities, anywhere where there's somebody who requires menstrual products. And I pulled up to the Kingston shelter the other day, and there was nobody there. And I called, no answer to the phone, no response from email. The security guard who was there, they said, well, the person normally come in X time. So what I did was basically stayed in the area and waited and waited. Get some stuff done until they eventually came. I showed up eventually. I showed up initially at about 10 o'clock in the morning. The person eventually showed up sometime around 2 o'clock. Now, what I thought to myself was, here it is, I'm trying to donate products, because usually when we go donate to homes and shelters, we don't just do menstrual products, we do personal care items. So we put wipes and deodorant and, the stuff that you would need to clean up yourself. And when we went there was nobody there. And somebody finally showed up at 2 o'clock. And I'm like, then what if I was somebody trying to escape and come to this place that is supposed to be a refuge for me? I would have had to wait 5 hours for somebody to show up. Like, how does that work? So ditto to everything Nicolette just said, as well as I don't think, it is, I'm going to say it out loud and it's going to sound really wrong, but let us just say, I do not think that this problem is considered serious, because it's not treated like it's serious. It's not treated like it's life or death. It's not treated like people are escaping and need somewhere to go because their life is in danger. And until we start to treat it with that kind of urgency, like there's no urgency around women being harmed, like none. Like we just, it's in the news and social media make their comments, and until we hear about the other one, and some 8-year-old girl is raped by her father, and the news says, man had sexual relationship with his 8-year-old stepdaughter. That's not a sexual relationship. He's been raping the child. And sorry, continue.
I think part of the problem and what somewhat explains that is the fact that it has become so normalized. So we hear it and people hardly bat an eyelid at it anymore because we hear it every day, and there are spaces in which it is accepted, sad to say. I remember growing up and hearing people talk about, fathers fattening fowl for mongoose, and almost laughing at fathers who were not molesting their daughters in some of these I would say rural communities, but then at the time I thought it was unique to these pockets of our society, only to find out that it's more widespread and ingrained than I would have liked to thought. But just in responding to what you said, Shelley, and that's largely explains why people are so comfortable and unmoved by these realities, and also the notion of the rape culture of Jamaica. It is accepted, and people try to explain away and justify why a man might have done such harm to a woman or raped a girl. She asks you, she wears something short. We know the storyline. But that I think is at the heart of it. And further to the point Nicolette made earlier about the way we other people and groups that we see as fringes. To address that, we first have to address the stigmas around these communities. So there's not going to be any thrust towards including LGBTQ plus communities in these narratives unless that stigma is first addressed. And I don't even know how we effectively address it, but just to say that it continues to stand in the way of making any meaningful decisions that are truly inclusive in our society. I think there was an article in today's paper about the cost of excluding homosexual communities. I don't remember exactly the headline, but it's talking about the economic cost, how much we lose in our economy by excluding these communities, because we're not gainfully tapping into the skill sets and all the talents of these communities that we are so keen on keeping marginalized and on the outskirts of society.
Yeah, I agree as well, Aisha. Because we have a long way to go before even LGBTQ persons are going to start to feel welcome within these shelters. Even within normal cisgendered women, I've been reading and they're saying that during our natural disasters, during these times when people have to get displaced due to environmental migration, there is an increase in gender-based violence. And if our women don't feel safe being part of these shelters, I highly doubt the LGBTQ members are going to feel that way as well.
I mean, you'll have government officials who outrightly say we just not make no space for no gay people, like them
Yeah.
up on their own. But when you're dealing with that mentality and mindset at that level, then what you expect other people to say and do, and why would you expect them to put any thought, any intentional thought into creating spaces that are accommodating to these communities? And the pushback from the rest of the society on this is going to be very huge. I mean, what we've benefited from so far in terms of pushing the envelope somewhat is international pressure, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done in country to change mindsets and to create that groundswell, in terms of the populace nationally to demand, fairness and justice in the treatment of these communities.
I think there was a mention of rape culture earlier, and I think that part of our whatever it is that we plan to do long term has to be forcefully addressing some of the problematic things that we have in our culture that encourages bad behavior from our male gender. And one of the things that I notice, I go to primary schools. We do period workshops in schools from primary right up to tertiary education. And I distinctly remember being at a primary school and a first grade little boy. He I don't know how he got the pad in his hand, but he pick up a pad and can't come give me. And his friends was laughing at him. So I said, what are you laughing about? And he said, a girl something that. And then like he didn't realize it was a girl thing. He threw it down and go, ew. So I said, what is the problem? You had no problem holding it a while ago. He said, Miss, that nasty. I said, why is it nasty? Because it's girl something. And I thought to myself, who taught him that? Who taught him that girl things are nasty? And if we're teaching our little boys that girls are nasty and being compared to them is somehow insulting in some ways, then this is not just about male female response. This is not just about how we look at adults when they are being violated. This has to speak to the fact that we, from a cultural standpoint, see female as less or see anything associated with female as less. And like it or not, the LGBT community is grouped in an even lesser category. So if we start by saying that female is the lesser gender, and then we look at all the other genders even lesser than that, then obviously putting things in place and treating our needs as priorities is going to be challenging, because we first would have to see it as something important for us to allocate resources and to actually work towards fixing it. So how do we address the cultural aspect of the way we see the biggest part of our populace? Because there are more women than men in our society, and if you add the LGBT from the pile of women in the society, that's the majority of the society. So how do we treat the majority of the society as less than and expect to see any real change?
Okay, yes, a very good conversation. Anyway, so we're moving on into our next question, and this is for Aisha. It said that in March 2021, the UNFPA estimated that 12 million women have seen contraceptive interruptions, leading to 1.4 million unintended pregnancies. How do you see this playing out in Jamaica? Are we equipped to address this impending reality?
Is the impending reality the many unplanned births or the disruption in contraceptive access? I think in any case it's something that we are ill-equipped to respond to. Um, if we think back to pre-COVID times and the challenges we had in terms of accessing um, services, accessing contraceptives, the whole abortion debate, and the deaths that we had early on in the pandemic as well. I forgot the name of the young woman who had died seeking maternal care. But in any case, the examples of inefficiencies that we had prior to COVID, if those are anything to go by, then it says that we are likely to be in a worse off position going forward. I think our healthcare system has been severely impacted by COVID, and a lot of the shortcomings in the system have been highlighted in the last couple of years. Um, I think we've had sufficient time, though, to put plans in place, but I find that we're largely not reactive, or rather proactive,
Proactive.
rather reactive. And so until that comes into play, then we won't do anything about it. um, the one of the likely impacts of that we will see is the increased incidence of, say, teenage mothers, the increased trauma associated with that, of the pressure of being a teenage mom, the increased incidence of sexual abuse in homes. We talk a lot about the fact that schools have been closed, and these cases of rape and abuse, sexual abuse in homes. So that is already recorded. I think what we have to brace ourselves for are the now long-term implications of this reality. But I would like to think that, because we are seeing what is happening in other places, and because, in spaces like these we're already having these conversations, that there are power brokers amongst us who are taking these issues to the spaces where these decisions can be made, so that we put plans in place to offset as best as possible the worst implications of this, because we are trending towards some really, really scary realities in the next coming months. And I don't know that the next coming months will take us towards the end of COVID either, because COVID looks like it's here to stay for a little while.
Very true, very true. All right. So, how can we adjust our approach to climate change, climate action, and sexual reproductive rights to build synergies with towards improving women's access to reproductive health services? I'll actually answer first.
Well, I always like to start with the sharing of information. I think comprehensive reproductive health education is necessary, and not just for kids. I think that adults have to be included in the conversation, because part of the problem that we have, especially when we go into school, is that we don't, for us to work effectively, we have to have the buy-in from the parents. And a lot of the times they themselves are not equipped with all the information that they need, or even most of the information that they need to help their children. So the education is lacking right across the board. I think that part of the conversation also has to include looking at reusable menstrual products. I think that, especially as it relates to climate conversation, and how, with the water situation, as well as with the conversation around plastics that is happening internationally, I think we have to look at reusable products as a real option, because these products will now help to solve some of the issue of having more plastics in the environment. And since a lot of governments are having conversations around banning plastics, the disposable products are going to be a part of that discussion, because I don't know if you know this or not, but menstrual products are among the top 5 products that are found in the marine life, plastic products that are found in marine life. So they have whales and fisheries that have a lot of menstrual products, from the packaging to the product itself. And so it is a part of the conversation around the plastics in the environment. And that's why looking at reusable products is going to be something that we have to take seriously, especially in the next coming years. And that is going to require a lot of education, because culturally, the idea of using something and then having to clean it and use it again is something that a lot of women are just simply not interested in accepting. But it is an option that a lot more women around the world are taking up. So it's definitely something that we have to take a look at. And that's why I think we have to start with the information and the education.
Yeah, and on the note of education, I believe also, not just improving women and girls, but men and boys as well. Also,
No,
times
they have to be included. We
they have to
include
be
them every
included.
single
They have to be
every
included as
single
well.
period. Yeah, man.
Yeah,
Every single period workshop
they
that
have to
we
be
do in
included
a
as
poet
well.
school, the boys are in the class.
Yeah, But the thing is that a lot of them have a stigma that they don't need to learn about it. I'll be talking about it
Actually,
with
the
my
boys don't. That's
students.
not true.
They don't
The
want to
boys don't
introduce
have a
them.
stigma. Their parents
Some
do.
of them, some
Their
of them.
mothers do. The boys don't have any problem. Whenever we go to a school and we include the boys, they are the ones that are the most curious. They have all the questions. They want to touch the products. They have no issues. Who has issues is their mothers. When they go home to their mothers call the school and raise holy hell. I've had to be at many a parent teachers meeting trying to calm down mothers who are accusing me of turning them son gay because I give him a panty to hold. So the boys are fine. It's their parents.
Yeah, I think the stigma comes from the older generation that they are
Mm-hmm.
trying to, yeah. Yeah, Eleanor is talking about Team Menstrual Cup. Yeah, the Menstrual Cups is definitely something that we need to start to incorporate more because,
Well, well,
we used to do it
I want to
twice.
take this opportunity to invite all the ladies on the live right now. If you would like to try a menstrual cup, please to find me. You can. I'm going to put my email address here, but you can also find me online at her floor anyway. We have donations of menstrual cups, but like I said, culturally, a lot of women are not comfortable trying any product that they have to reuse. So I have the cups, but I don't just want to give them out randomly. We want to actually give the person the information that they need to show them how to use it and all that kind of thing. So if you're interested in getting a free menstrual cup, all I need from you is a testimonial. So when you use it, tell me how it was, good, bad, or indifferent, so that we can have the records because we're trying to get more persons to try reusable products.
Okay, nice. All right, Aisha, I'm going to ask just state the question. How can we adjust our approach to climate action and sexual reproductive rights to work to build synergies towards improving women's access to reproductive health services?
Yeah. Before I respond to that, I'm just realizing that culture and cultural beliefs has come up a few times in the discussion, and it brought me back to a project that I worked on recently. Jamaica conducted what we call a technology needs assessment, where we're determining what technologies we need to adopt in Jamaica, as a part of um, creating this shift in technologies and reducing emissions and promoting adaptation. And when we did that analysis of what are the barriers to adoption of these technologies, we had to do um, what you call a problem tree analysis and a root cause analysis. And for every technology that was put forward, when we did that analysis, it worked out that at the root of that problem, of the root or the main barrier to adoption was culture. It was either an unwillingness to try something new. It was either cultural perceptions that banks and financial institutions were corrupt. It was either beliefs around politics and corruption. But every which way we turned, cultural beliefs posed a threat and served as a hindrance to adoption of new technologies and new practices. And again, I suppose in this conversation, what I'm trying to establish is that there, even as we talk climate change, as we talk COVID, as we talk sexual and reproductive health, culture again and beliefs and the way people are tied to these sometimes repressive ideas is kind of scary, because people often and sadly are unwilling to embrace a new belief, embrace a new idea. We see it even when we talk about LGBT community and people being so rigid and sometimes hypocritical in said beliefs, and standing firm against these ideas. But in response to your question, as a climate change practitioner most days, one of the things that I have to do as a part of the formal work is to support the development of what we call national adaptation plans. So NAPs and other what are strategic frameworks of climate action that countries are developing, national adaptation plans, nationally determined contributions, national communications. These are all strategic policy documents that countries are developing as a part of their commitment and responsibility as parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so in responding to that, my view is that we have to see an integration of these asks of these thematic issues around sexual and reproductive health in these formal documents. It is only there that we will see countries being held accountable to these ideas, to being asked to adhere to the commitments that they're making. It has to become commonplace in the high level discussions. It is not yet there. And so a lot of these discussions about sexual and reproductive health are happening on the sidelines of the formal discussions about climate change. For now, the conversation around climate and the climate solutions are dominated by conversations about technology and market-based solutions. What we need is the continued agitation of feminist groups and feminist activists to ensure that conversations and themes such as sexual and reproductive health become commonplace, become mainstreamed in those discussions. And we have to establish as well the linkages between the more prominent discussion points such as water and agriculture and economic growth, and establish those connections to sexual and reproductive health, because those connections can be established. Right off the bat, I will say that if women, for instance, cannot access contraceptives, cannot access menstrual products, cannot access reproductive health services, then how do you function on a regular basis to maintain your productivity as a part of the formal economy? So even just on that basis, if we have to be forced to work it out as dollars and cents, we can do that, because there's certainly validation for that. But hopefully also as a matter of human rights and gender justice and climate justice, they would be willing at the highest levels of decision making around climate change to recognize the importance of integrating those conversations to ensure that the solutions that we come up with to address the climate crisis really benefit everybody, and no one is left behind.
Yes, true. Miss Charlene, you want to add anything to that, or you look like?
No, well, I mean, she made all the important points, especially the fact that in the conversation around climate change, sexual and reproductive health isn't a part of it at all, and it is absolutely necessary, because for some reason, whenever we talk about moving forward and growing as a society and even improving technology and all of that part of the conversation is never included. And the truth is, as long as women are going to be designated the caregivers, as long as it is still our responsibility to be domestic queens and mothers and nurses and all of the things that we do that we don't get paid for, it has to be a part of the conversation, because all of these things are affected. So we might get the great technology, we still have to go to work, and then we have to do something with our children. So childcare has to be a part of the conversation. We still have periods, so that has to be there. We still have to give birth. So all of those things need to be included in all the plans that we have to grow and to improve as a society overall. And they are not, which is mind-blowing.
Yeah, because even like I was hearing that when COVID started, a lot of funds that was allocated for women reproductive rights and health had to get moved and put into COVID-19, and that's quite sad, because it's quite sad to think that they don't put any priority on women reproductive health, that we would have to just take all the funds or not all the funds, but allocate the funds just like that, without even taking in consideration how it's going to affect our women and our girls.
One of the hashtags that we have on our social media platform is periods don't stop for pandemics. And we have that hashtag because that's exactly it. A lot of schools who had the teachers, because what we do when we donate to school, we work with the nurses and the guidance counselors. They ended up having to give the products to the girls. So they will call them, even though schools are closed, they will call them and say, "Miss, can I still come for my pack of pad?" Because now they're at home, their mothers don't have any, them sister don't have any, so they get that one pack of pad from the school that we donate to the school. Now they have to take it home and share it with their mother and the sister and the auntie and all the other women in the yard who they live with. And so now you realize that there is a greater need as a result of the pandemic. So the fact that resources that were supposed to be allocated to address this particular thing is moved in the pandemic. Is like, well, excuse me, this still a keep. This didn't stop. It's not like all the periods said, okay, we'll wait until after COVID will return.
Are you thinking about ease of access with the COVID as well? Persons aren't able to just go out and just get it just like how they usually are. So accessibility is basically decreased as well because of COVID-19.
And access also in terms of being able to...
Well, our outreach has had to increase.
Access also in terms of being able to afford the product, because the fact is that a pack of pad in some households is a luxury item. Like, how do you budget so that a young girl can buy a pack of pad, as opposed to buying a pound of rice? That's a decision that some households have to make, and sadly, sometimes it comes down. If you have to choose between feeding your family and buying a pack of pad, then the pack of pad can stay. So when we're talking about climate change and loss of incomes, or COVID-19 and loss of incomes, because so many persons and households have now lost access to income streams or remittances or whatnot, those are hard decisions that people are being forced to make. Do we eat or do we buy pads?
Well, that is the reality for almost all the women who we talk to. It comes literally. That's what it comes down to. And one of the things that I make a pain to explain where period poverty is concerned is that period poverty does not look the same for everybody. So you have a lot of people who dress up nice and at work. You're probably talking to her when you go into the office and she's the receptionist and she's sitting with a piece of tissue in her underwear instead of a pad because she just broke. Broke, a keep. Broke is a thing. And she literally only have the money to pay her bus fare, to take her to and from work until she gets paid again. So it's not just the people who are, okay, well, they don't have any money at all. And, so a lot of people think of period poverty and they can't fathom how a woman can't find the money to buy something, and it is so important. But it's just because your situation is so privileged that it never even occurred to you that the reality is either you're going to eat or you're going to buy pads. And so right now, as a part of our plans for next year, we're challenging corporate offices to put menstrual product inside of their bathrooms for their staff. Because there's a lot of women in those offices who are wearing tissue. So they end up, if they can time it and see how much the tissue, how much more tissue they're buying at a certain time. From a certain period to a certain period, they can see how much more tissue they're buying. If they have to buy the extra tissue, just buy the pad them and done now.
And that is why we see in more progressive economies, and I don't know if it's a matter of, wealth in this case, or just foresight among these leaders, where they have, abolished taxes on period products, or in some instances made them freely accessible to everyone, because of the recognition that, as Shelley rightly said, periods are not going anywhere. This is something that women have to deal with on a monthly basis and should not feel any shame about having to, go without or being forced to make a decision about, accessing that or some other thing that is of an equally significant or greater need at that point.
Just to answer your question about the countries, the wealthier countries who started, Scotland was the first country to throw 10 million pounds at period poverty. And they started by saying, okay, we're going to deal with schools. No girl should stop from school because they don't have any pads. No, they started with the homeless women. Then they went to school. And let me tell you how that happened. A female parliamentarian was in her car and her period started. Apparently, she was unprepared. So she ran from her car to the office. And by the time she got to her office, she messed up herself because her period started. And she went to the bathroom and she came into Parliament and she was talking about, she's like, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe what happened. And, she cleaned up and everything. And then she said, but what do homeless women do? And from that, they gave free menstrual products to homeless women. Then it developed to free menstrual products for school. And they were the first country to say free menstrual products for everybody who needed it. So it's not just a question of wealth, it's also a question of priority. Because the truth is, If you are the person who are making the decision and you're in a position that you can relate to a certain thing and it matters enough to you, you're going to push it through. Part of the issue that we have in our country is that this is not considered a priority. And that is why when I hear people say, oh, there's so many women in Jamaican parliament, I say so.
Yeah.
And I will
Um,
leave it there.
I think New Zealand's another country that I believe is now on board, and they,
Recently, yeah,
right.
no, but New Zealand has an amazing prime minister.
That we know. That we know. Um,
Yeah.
that is an evident show of women, woman power, empathetic
Yes,
leadership, transformational leadership, everything at play. But just in keeping with what you said, one of the things that will be needed and very much of importance in this cause is a champion, someone
yes,
who champions this cause, not just from the perspective of science, but from the perspective of justice, from the perspective of equity. Someone who brings into every discussion, at every level, the importance of engaging and integrating women's needs, women's concerns, and women's welfare as a part of this COVID, a part of this climate narrative.
correct, correct.
So, all right. So we're moving on to our next question, and according to a study on advancing gender equality in environmental migration and disaster displacement in the Caribbean by the United Nations, in the aftermath of disasters, Caribbean women and girls experience heightened mortality rates and risk of gender-based violence, as well as additional barriers to meeting their recovery and livelihood. How important is it for us to adopt a social justice framework for climate mitigation? Aisha.
Um, you said climate mitigation. I don't know if you meant adaptation, because in my
Yeah.
kind of climate practitioner mind, I'm dancing between mitigation and adaptation as these two streams of climate management or governance. Um, but the quote that you made is certainly very true. We've seen it at play. Um, and that's why we see in this rise in human trafficking, this rise in the numbers of young women and in many instances young men who are being trafficked into situations where they're lured by the promise of a job or some opportunity, and they find themselves in untoward situations because of this increasing burden on their economic situation, the loss of income and whatnot. People are being dragged into different, heists and scams as they look a way out. And unfortunately, in many instances, that happens to women and girls. One of the things that, is going to be very important as we create these solutions, and a lot of countries are already kind of inching towards this, is a question of, again, justice. How do we create frameworks that are equally accessible to men, women, and people across all classes and jurisdictions, so that when we pivot in any direction, in any opportunity or solution that we're turning to the as a solution to the climate crisis, we're not excluding anyone unfairly from this. You talked about mitigation, and again, if we're talking mitigation as it pertains to the decreased climate greenhouse gases, decreased emissions and greenhouse gases, one of the things that is happening extensively across the Caribbean right now is this push towards um, uptake of renewable energy and transitioning from the use of fossil fuels. And this new paradigm leans a lot towards the use of, say, electric vehicles and recharge electric batteries for different, even production of electricity and storage of solar energy. And one of the realities that women experience and face in the Caribbean, in across the lower echelons especially, is that there is this huge gender gap. There's this huge disparity in the salaries of men and women. And so there's a question of whether or not women will be able to afford these technologies that they're now bringing on the market or thinking about bringing on the market. So a lot of countries are creating what we call these nationally determined contributions, where they're outlining their adaptation and mitigation targets. And as a part of those mitigation targets, they're saying we're going to cut the use of fossil fuels entirely by 2040. We're going to ensure that all vehicles on our roads are electric vehicles. And my thing is, as a part of that debate, we need to ensure that these are gender responsive measures, that we are carefully considering whether or not women can afford these technologies, can use these technologies. And so a part of preparing for that is addressing these systemic and structural issues that at the moment will bar women from being able to access these technologies. Sorry if I carried scientific or made it too leaned towards the mitigation definition, but if you meant more broadly, then we can talk about that later on.
Yeah, so we're basically coming to a close, but before we do so, I just want you guys to share your emails in the chat. That way, if anyone wants to contact you guys for further questions, they can do so.
Well, I shared mine earlier.
Okay. All right. Does anyone has any questions they want to direct to Shalayan and Aisha? Let's see any questions. Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap up. So what's one piece of advice that you would offer to organizations that are advocating for sustainable use of environmental resources, as well as inclusive, equitable, and just involving climate actions?
Oh, well, all right. So what one piece of advice I would offer? I would say try to ensure that you speak to everybody who this decision is going to affect. I think part of the issue that we have where inclusivity is concerned is that sometimes decisions are just made without having any sort of feedback from the persons who this decision is supposed to benefit. And I think we can solve that issue by including them in the research, in the preliminary discussion, so that we can be more efficient in how we offer services. Another thing that I think that we have to take in consideration is the whole picture. And what I mean by that is a lot of the times when we talk to, as an advocate, when I go to organizations, whether it is educational institutions or corporate offices, and we try to bring attention to well, for me is usually around reproductive health and how it affects their staff and the output and the productivity. And a lot of the times they don't see how, if the receptionists don't have any pad today, affects the overall bottom line. And there's a whole way that I show it to them and I connect it, because it's not hard to do. But the truth is, if we're not looking at the full picture, then we miss these kind of things. And that's why you end up with persons in your organization who are suffering in silence with an issue that can be easily addressed. And so when we're looking at climate change and the point that I don't remember her name made a while ago about the fact that the wage gap is a thing, it's not just the fact that women are making less money than men, but women's money goes into caregiving. So a lot of the times a woman's salary has to not just feed her immediate family who she lives with, but she's probably taking care of an aunt, a sick aunt, or her mother in a nursing home or something like that. And men get to spend their money on the things that they want, whether it is that they're investing or they're buying the car that they want to buy, the electric car, and all these kind of things. And so that should be in consideration as well with the overall plan. So I'm just saying, speak to the end user, speak to the persons who are trying to solve their problem whenever you're putting these policies in place.
Okay, Aisha?
Yeah, Shirley, ditto on that for sure, in terms of engaging those who you claim to be representing at every step of the process. And so, it's not just consultations with them when you're starting or determining, the concept that you're working on, but at every stage of that process through to completion, to ensure that their needs are duly represented. I'll add to that that, you know, be consistent. Don't don't come to the table claiming that you know, are for a particular cause and then abandon it midway. You know what I mean? So if your cause and call for climate justice is something that you are going to adopt, make sure that at every opportunity, wherever you go, at every level that you engage the conversation, that you bring that to the table. One of the things that, you know, we talk a lot about now in the climate justice space is that kind of global north divide and this notion of virtuous versus victims. And we, you know, we very much are opposed to this notion of global south, and particularly women being named and branded as victims. One of the things that we're big on is promoting the agency of women and the voice of women as, and you know, women's contribution to the creation of solutions to the climate crisis. And what I want to see is that the people who are charged with taking these stories and taking this cause to the highest levels for decision making and negotiations at every level are continuing to do that in a very wholesome and you know, fair manner. And even as we talked earlier about LBGT communities, you know, being brave enough to stand up for communities that are less represented, indigenous communities, bringing groups and themes to the discussions that have long been left on the sidelines, and being brave and bold enough to bring them into the mainstream discussions so that, you know, it's addressed in a more wholesome and holistic manner. And every community, every group of persons that, you know, we represent feel a part of this discussion, and it's inclusive and just as best as possible.
Yeah, I agree as well. Every level of decision making needs to have representation in order to enable better decision making. It was okay, so it's nice having you guys with us, and I will have to invite you guys to come again. So we're wrapping up now, and I'm just going to thank everyone who are coming today. Thank Miss Aisha and Miss Shalayan Weeks for joining us. It was really a very interactive discussion. And I want to thank everyone who has tuned in today. And my name is Narisha Morale, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your Sunday evening.
Thank you, Narisha. Thank you, everyone.
Follow us on social media at Her Flow. We're having a fibroid conference on the 25th of February,
All right,
25th of
guys, thank you
July.
for joining us. And remember to follow us at our Footprint Jamaica, and just keep in tune for future events.